Florida. If you're young enough or old enough to remember the Florida 2000 recount, where the Supreme Court stole an election for George W. Bush, it looks like there's the same type of election fraud ready to happen in Florida now. So I already covered the Georgia issue yesterday. I also covered Andrew Gillum and DeSantis, and there's some funny things going on with that too. Thank you, OTR Trucker, $5 in the super chat. When I was young, law enforcement kept and published gun statistics. The truth about accidental gun deaths, especially, had a big effect on gun sales. That's true. Good point. So now you have, and I want to make something abundantly clear before I even mention Rick Scott versus Bill Nelson. Frankly, I don't really give a damn if Bill Nelson loses or wins, because Bill Nelson is a corrupt Democrat. He is a corrupt establishment Democrat. He takes money from fossil fuels and fracking and says nothing against these oil pipelines and this fracking, and allows Florida to burn with the rest of the planet. So not a fan of Bill Nelson, not covering this because I think, God, we have to save Bill Nelson. I don't give a damn. I think Rick Scott's terrible, but I can't really sit here and be like, well, we got to fight tooth and nail to reelect Bill Nelson. Bill Nelson is your dime a dozen corporate, corrupt, establishment Democrat. That's the truth. So two things could be true. He's corrupt. He's part of the problem. But on the other end, Rick Scott and what he's trying to do in Florida is also corrupt. So I'm going to say both. So not only do you have in Georgia, literally the Secretary of State of Georgia was purging hundreds of thousands of people while running for governor. That's not even a conflict of interest. That's a complete and utter ethics tsunami. He should have had to step down as Secretary of State as soon as he launched for governor. But because apparently we don't have conflict of interest laws in this country, you could do whatever the hell you want. And press the share button. Let's get this video to more people. So, not only do you have this corruption in Georgia, but you have the governor of Florida, Rick Scott, who's also running to be the senator from Florida because his term as governor is up. Now, he is basically, because he's up, I think, by like 0.2 of a point, 0.2% he's up, which is automatic. I think it's automatic. It's automatic recount, and I think 0.1 or 0.2% is automatic manual recount. So Rick Scott now, as governor, is essentially taking actions to try and basically stop more votes from being counted that could actually reelect Bill Nelson or get Bill Nelson more votes. And again, I think Bill Nelson's awful. I think Bill Nelson's a corrupt Democrat. Go look at his donor sheet. You'll see why. Takes a lot of money from big oil, a lot of money for the big banks, turns the other way as the big sugar lobby screws Florida and all that. But democracy is democracy, and you literally have Rick Scott now playing God as the governor of Florida. He's talking about sending troops down to oversee the vote counting and all these things. So let's look at the latest here. We're literally living in a banana republic. So this is from USA Today. A Broward County circuit judge has ordered Broward County Supervisor of Elections Brenda Snipes to release records requested by Governor Rick Scott and the National Republican Senatorial Campaign Committee related to provide public records related to voting tabulations. Scott and the NRSC filed a lawsuit against Snipes after she allegedly refused to release details on tabulations. Broward Circuit Judge Carol Lisa Phillips ordered the Supervisor of Elections office to release the records, which includes the most current records related to how many ballots have been cast in the county, the amount of ballots that have been counted, and any documents that explain how many ballots are left to be counted by 7 p.m. The ruling has nothing to do with the allegations of voter fraud Scott and other Republicans made Thursday against Snipes. So you have Rick Scott and President Trump ranting about, voter fraud that doesn't even exist. So this is really something. Rick Scott, as the governor, is literally requesting an investigation and trying to use law enforcement, basically send out his troops to look into voter fraud that might be hurting him as Senate candidate. I mean, you cannot have more of a conflict of interest. After the Florida Department of Law Enforcement said Thursday night it would investigate 2 local election officials at the request of Governor Rick Scott, the agency now says that because no voter fraud allegations were made, it is no longer pursuing an investigation. What changed is that this morning we spoke with the Department of State and they indicated they had no criminal allegations of fraud, an FDLE spokesperson told Politico. So after speaking to them, we offered our assistance in the event any criminal allegations are identified. During an event organized by the U.S. Senate campaign Thursday night, Scott asked FDLE to investigate Broward County of Elections Brenda Snipes and Palm Beach County Supervisor of Elections Susan Butcher. Those 2 counties have come under heat from Republicans because after Scott, Republican gubernatorial nominee Ron DeSantis and Republican Agriculture Commissioner candidate Matt Caldwell led their Democratic opponents after election night, their leads have narrowed as the 2 Democratic stronghold counties continue to find votes. Quote, Broward and Palm Beach counties are still finding and counting ballots, Scott said at the event, which was held at the Florida Governor's Mansion in Tallahassee. The people of Florida deserve fairness and transparency, and the supervisors are failing to give it to them. So, what exactly is the corrupt part of that, Governor Scott? That there's more ballots that need to be counted because Florida is notoriously awful at counting ballots, awful at running elections? You were the governor of Florida. Maybe you could have done something about that. Just a thought. Just a thought. As governor of Florida for 8 years, maybe you could have done something to expedite voting, counting, expedite the voting infrastructure, expedite and improve voting machinery, expedite and make one uniform policy for all counties on how ballots have to look, because apparently every county looks different. And they designed their ballots very differently, which actually ended up screwing Bill Nelson, because it seems that in Broward County, I believe, they had the Senate race between Scott and Nelson. The governor's race was very noticeable on the ballot, right at the top. You make your selection, but Scott versus Nelson, the Senate race was all the way down in the left corner, and apparently a lot of people didn't see it, so therefore didn't vote for Scott or Nelson. Maybe as governor you could have done something about that. Now it's biting you in the ass. But basically, Scott, President Trump, and all these Republicans are basically crying voter fraud and crying, oh, they're finding imaginary votes. No, not all the votes. Not all the votes are in. There's a lot of provisional ballots. There's a lot of absentee ballots. There's also military ballots, overseas ballots. So because Rick Scott, as governor, doesn't want Bill Nelson to get any more votes, because the more the margin shrinks, the better chance that a recount would actually help win the election for Bill Nelson. But you can't make this stuff up. The governor of Florida is trying to use his law enforcement to basically try and win the election for him. He was trying to send law enforcement as his role in governor to basically go stand there and watch the ballots be counted. That's an abuse of power. Governor Scott should have no role whatsoever. You want to file a lawsuit? That's fine. You want to cry voter fraud with no evidence? That's fine. He should have no part to play at all in the overseeing of the ballots being counted and all of his stuff. And again, I'm not a fan of Bill Nelson. I don't really care if he wins or loses, to tell you the truth. I think Rick Scott would make a terrible senator, but I think Bill Nelson's a terrible senator. So take your pick of terrible senators between the two of them. But we're supposed to live in a democracy. Sam here, and I do believe Jordan and Jen have seen the news. What news? Which news am I? The live chat's going quick, so I don't know which news you're talking about. So, it's unbelievable. Between Brian Kemp, the corrupt Secretary of State in Georgia, purging hundreds of thousands of people so that he could win, and that's still unfolding. Stacey Abrams has not conceded, thankfully. And now Rick Scott trying to essentially rig it for himself. And you want to talk about the threat of Russian attack on our democracy? Are you kidding me? Vincier says, how about upholding a favor and free election for both sides? I think you meant free and fair elections for both sides. Absolutely. Jeremy Gifford, you want Nelson in because you want Democratic control of the Senate? Nelson winning isn't going to give them control. They're already down 5 or 6 points. And frankly, I mean, I don't want the Republicans to be in power on the Senate, but you think the Democrats, what, you think Chuck Schumer and the Democrats having control of the Senate is going to magically close the income inequality gap in this country? You think that's going to magically have an assault weapons ban? You think that's going to magically, provide government jobs programs for inner cities and economically depressed communities like Flint, Detroit, Cleveland, Milwaukee, Baltimore, Chicago? I could go on. You think the Democrats retaking the Senate's going to do that? Not these Democrats. You got Nancy Pelosi in the House. She wants to be Speaker again. They just retook the House. She's talking about, oh, we're gonna be as bipartisan as possible, and we're gonna just engage in the, what does she call it? The marketplace of ideas. Yeah, the marketplace of our ideas that our donors allow. The marketplace of ideas that our donors allow. And don't get me wrong. Don't get me wrong. I actually am semi-happy that the Democrats retook the House because I think it is a toxic situation in America when Trump and these Republican extremists have complete control. So I do think it's good that there's somewhat of a check now on Trump. However, these Democrats aren't exactly fighting for you, folks. 70% of the country wants Medicare for all. If you look at the exit polls in the country, I reported this yesterday, this was the top issue of the midterms. 41%. In the exit poll said healthcare was their top issue. So let's look at two numbers. 70% of Americans want Medicare for all. That would 52% of those are Republicans. You got 70% total want Medicare for all. 85% of the Democratic Party wants Medicare for all. 52% of Republicans want Medicare for all. 41% in the exit polls. Top issue, healthcare. Far past the economy. Yet Nancy Pelosi, oh, we can't do Medicare for all. It's just not realistic. Fight, goddammit! Make Donald Trump, put him on the defensive, as Bernie Sanders said. Expose him as a fake populist. Donald Trump is the one during the campaign who said about Keystone. And by the way, Cheryl, don't think I didn't notice. I know you're going through a rough time, so I'm thinking of you. I saw those messages. So it's just unbelievable. And with Rick Scott, it doesn't just end with thinking about sending his sending his law enforcement there to basically intimidate and stand over people counting ballots. He purged. He's the Brian Kemp of Florida. I mean, read this. A Rick Scott appointee is in charge of calling for a Nelson Scott Senate recount. So the governor of Florida, his Secretary of State that he appointed, will be in charge of a possible recount. Ken Detzner, Florida Secretary of State, once conducted a voter roll purge so obvious that the U.S. Department of Justice had to swoop in and stop him. Earlier this year, Detzner brazenly tried to prevent the state from opening more early voting sites at colleges, which a judge said revealed a stark pattern of discrimination. To call Detzner a close Rick Scott ally is an understatement. The governor and senator-elect gave Detzner his job, and the pair has spent the past 8 years hatching obvious stunts to prevent Floridians from voting. Now Detzner is magically in charge of initiating any possible recount in the race between incumbent Democratic Senator Bill Nelson, a man with whom Detzner personally feuded on the 2018 campaign trail, and Scott. While it's more than likely that Detzner will wind up acquiescing and ordering the move, the situation, a cabinet member ordering a recount that could hurt his own governor, smacks of a conflict of interest. I think Bill Nelson should have been gone long ago. I don't want Rick Scott to win the Senate seat, but this isn't about whether I like Bill Nelson or not. This is about democracy.